frames as a person is a person through persons. So Ubuntu evolves an individual being evolved an individual being an individual in a community and belong within social, moral, and political framework. In has his or their existence of being, Ubuntu, or a person, strives to create conditions of existence with other beings. So Ubuntu is fluid, dynamic, and will be articulated later on when I get to our strategies that we deployed this work. So one of the very first undertaking of cultural labor as researchers was setting up a sex workers steering committee. A governance body or structure made up of sex workers hinged on the activism and solidarity approach in South Africa of nothing about us without us. Given we the researchers were not homeless or street-based sex workers, this framing became a central point for us. The main role of the sex workers DIRCOM was to advise on the day-to-day running of the project through overseeing processes involved with the implementation. This was set up at the very beginning of the project through a call with our NGO partner. The initial meeting with the sex workers DIRCOM was full of excitement about the project, but there was also a lot of mistrust from the group. We had to engage with a lot of negotiation in order to make this collaboration matter. In a sense, that brought about recognition of some form of dignity, rather than reinforce or remain complicit to systems of power that marginalize. These negotiations were both at institutional, so University of Cape Town NGO level, or University of Cape Town, and where the money came from in the global north. These were difficult conversations. Oh, yes, I can get into that a little bit later. But it was necessary work that needed to be done. We had to do that and shift some of the prescriptions that came with some of these funding, that it needed to be done in this way alone. And so that was sort of the first framing of cultural labor that I'm talking about here. And of course, and therefore this called for constant renegotiation, continuous critical reflexivity and solidarity. That was not self-serving, but rather worked towards disruption of the very power structures within which, the framework within which we the researchers position. Because there's a lot of self-serving work out there. Look at me what I'm doing, I think when you're feminist scholar, it wasn't really all about that. It was really about doing the work. And that's difficult work. Some of those engagements and conversations were really difficult in pushing some of these boundaries. In the first meaningful cross-border collaboration as praxis, as Nida calls it, we worked with the DIRCOM, which was set up at the beginning of the project, who played a central role in setting up of the theatre group. So this involved preparing for and overseeing through audition processes, for instance. In the DIRCOM, one of the members, for instance, was good at graphic design and designed the posters which we put through our NGO partner Safe Spaces to call for the editions. And one of the members, for instance, had a background in theatre and was involved in the workshopping of the editions with our colleagues and fellow researcher Sarah Matchett, who's the theatre maker. Sarah Matchett is an amazing theatre maker, by the way. I'll put it out there. and brought in, so Sarah brought in her peers and her peers, based at the Center for Data Performance Studies, who worked as judges, but who subsequently then did the trainings with the peers group. And so they workshopped what was the auditions, and through this we were able to pick an initial team of 13 members, but due to funding restrictions, we narrowed down to 10 members and then eventually 8. I need to keep an eye on that. And the members, as I mentioned earlier, those who are unloved, we had about 3 or 4 homeless, as street-based sex workers. So really abject marginality in this regard. And we worked with them over the entirety of the project, the same group, over a period of 3.5 years. So against the backdrop of the unloved, who I mentioned earlier, the STEARCOM members at times served as mediators between the sex workers theatre group that was subsequently formed. The NGO, because we know NGO spaces are not, safe spaces, so to speak, especially, for the so-called group of beneficiaries they're serving. So and this so it works very much within a neoliberal NGO framework. I think with funding from the laws that comes with lots of restrictions, and what that means for especially street-based sex work. So the STEARCOM then worked as mediators between these various forms of institutions. The NGO, the University of Cape Town, and by extension, Goldsmiths, where the money is coming from, as well as other stakeholders involved. And so, but as I mentioned earlier, because we're committed to work within the framework of intersectionality and decoloniality, we interrogated all kinds of grievances, discomforts, and happiness. Within as processes of building trust. It's a part of was there. The other process also was this. So one of the issues that continually came back, and having carved out the unloved, an abject marginality, money became a central point of negotiation and renegotiation. This is a well-resourced project, so to speak, in research terms, right? It had a lot of money around exchanges and conferencing. Although money was factored in relation to knowing we were working with a group of street-based sex workers, were given a small stipend when we met. This was really chump change compared to breadcrumbs, compared to or support mothers or grandparents back at home, or basically attend to urgent needs. It speaks to the throngs of precarity and having no constant source of income. It speaks to the daily hustling to survive and looking after loved ones. And therefore, this urgency called for a response of structural border crossing that meant we renegotiated the fee that was eventually given out, one that brings about some form of pregnancy, depending on legislation. So one area we overlooked, so we were positionally blind, and again, this is within the framework of cultural labor, doing the actual work of shifting, was a professional psychosocial support, which was not part of the budget at all, estimated. So for the unloved, who are constantly dehumanized, combined with the theatre methodologies we work with, the center itself, laying bare lives of lived experience, we had to bring in a professional arts-based therapist to assist. We built in regular sessions, but this was also, she was also called on for sessions in moments of crisis or implosions. So the implosions were quite frequent at the beginning of the project, but when that group of unloved, full of mistrust and accustomed to competing for minimal resources, personally clashed both amongst the sex workers theatre group and the SpearCom as well as researchers, which was inevitable. However, the theatre methodologies also deployed work towards unbuilding some of these embodied emotional epistemologies of trauma and mistrust in combination with professional psychosocial support and from the therapists. These processes worked to produce new knowledge, which I'll talk about later. So what embodied theatre and performative theatre does in this encounter is to cultivate what Jackie Job, who was an amazing dancer, she's a Buddha practitioner, and Buddha is one of the theatre technique that was incorporated in the theatre process with the sex workers. She talks about the how embodied theatre processes cultivate an imagination that unbuilds inherited cultural epistemologies, that put the body in search of hidden knowledge, thereby offering another language that manifests itself in translation of different vocabularies, such as well-being, some may call it healing, but it's working towards building trust as well as another vocabulary around creative activism. And we'll talk more about this later. But perhaps those two examples are enough, because I'm looking at time. And then I'll hone in on what I call towards building a radical intimacy and kinship. So what did radical intimacy look like for us? If structures aim to create borders along the grounds of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, and others, then disrupting these borders brings forth with it an element of trust and consequently intimacy. Indeed, intimacy has the capacity to operate as a radical disruption of ideological constructs, and therefore processes political agency. Therefore, radical allyship calls for commitment to dismantling structural inequalities. It's a kind of allyship that's not situated in benevolence, but rather knowing where one is situated within systems of privilege, where they benefit from it, and work towards shifting or rupturing that. From the above discussion, it's clear that we researchers were located in institutions of privilege, in addition to other personal privilege that we may have come with. So rupturing this meant drawing on what Cornel West refers to as a revolutionary love, one that is rooted in freedom and justice, and one that sees the world through the lens of the unloved, oppressed, street sex workers in South Africa, and one that takes cognizance of their oppression, joy, culture, art, as spirituality, and more. And therefore, it's through doing such work of undoing and dismantling that we begin to mend some of the trust lacerated by non-belonging as a form of political intimacy and love develops. This love has various facets to it, such as dignity, humanizing, healing, joy, spirituality, and social justice. It's only through this that the bonds of kinship develop. For us, it was an articulation of the bonds of kinship, which I spoke to earlier. It opened up kinship beyond traditional family relations, and therefore the community, where one is located. So Ubuntu both as a philosophy and practice evokes empathy, trust, and reciprocity, as well as justice through principles of equality, equity, and fairness, and human dignity in this context, where freedom and trust are centralized, articulated through belonging. And recalling my earlier argument on trust in the introduction, Marcus points how trust is also a modality of human action, and therefore it's one of the fundamental requirements of social existence, where a repository of trust, kinship, friendship, and community or expert system. Trust denotes survival specific relations. And we see this in Ubuntu kinship, where individuality is expressed through communal interdependencies and sharing of obligations and responsibilities, and thereby opening up possibilities for those who are unloved. And again, there's a bit of school there that I won't get into. But so, what vocabularies then were deployed in this building of this so-called kinship that I'm talking about? One of them was the vocabulary of practices research. So the theatre processes that we worked with aim to sort of work towards humanity of the unloved, who are constantly dehumanized by the nation state. So the brain within performance as research or practice of research, these processes travel several boundaries, such as those within method and methodology or research and research. In other words, performance as research produces multiple vocabularies. So one of the vocabularies presents itself through working to flesh out archival narratives such as structural inequalities, physical, sexual violence, trauma of the unloved, the experience lodged in the body. Elsewhere, Sarah Matchett and I argue that the process of restoring both embodied and verbal is embedded in multiple iterations of the performance, as told through various embodied or verbalized ways, where agency lies in how one chooses to tell and retell their story or lived experience that end up being staged as a performance. And it is through these repetitions of how one tells their story and a multiplicity of retelling in verbal and embodied ways that works towards unbuilding architectural lodged in the body, such as trauma from forms of structural and political violence, in order to produce new epistemologies in the body itself. So, moreover, in the performance stage, the act of performing in front of an audience also provides the opportunity for the participant's story being witnessed by others. The act of witnessing is an enormously healing act in that it validates one's stories and experiences. Indeed, after each public performance, the theatre group felt or verbalized around experiences of being seen and witnessed. All this attests to the first vocabulary discussion here, which broadly can be framed within well-being. And it's through these processes that we're able to create spaces of belonging as a group or as a theatre group. So the other vocabulary is autobiographies produced from the lived experiences of sex workers, which ended up being performed in public performances. The knowledge deployed for each performance being creative activism. The project employed a collaborative approach to performance making and centered both the body and voice as the main aesthetic driver. For instance, through physical theater, the body was explored and deployed as the primary mode of aesthetic expression. So the choice to employ the body was not largely inspired by the desire to explore non-didactic approaches of performance and activism. One of the key aims of the work was to engage the aesthetic performance as a provocation, as an agitator. And as such, the physical theatre, the idea was to limit the use of spoken word and text, but merely rely on the body as a base of transmission. The effect on the audience was thus a visceral one, where the audience experienced and made sense of the performance through their body. So there's another school that I won't get into there. But secondly, the second vocabulary I locate in what we call holdings, or what I call holding space. As argued in the previous section, the unloved experience multiple forms of neglect and exclusion, and these manifest through physical and sexual assault, exclusions from service, inability to access justice, stereotypes, hunger, lack of shelter. The list is endless. All of which produce different kinds of trauma, which end up being stored in the body cells, as well as emotionally and psychologically. As discussed above, the theatre processes redeployed, dislodged some of the trauma, which meant holding space was an important part of our process. Corrigan defines holding space as an act of navigating of a paradox, being totally present and totally invisible, speaking to both physical and emotional presence. For us, this manifested mostly in two registers. The first being during the process of generating performance material, and secondly, in the actual performance. For the first one, the process of generating material involved provocations from the facilitator or director, targeted at a moment in life, such as childhood experience of violence, and how one got, for instance, how one got into sex work. Indeed, trauma was ever present in many of the lived realities and stories. And the director was central in the overall holding of the space, in addition to the group itself in holding each other, such as recognizing, giving a painful, traumatic moment, full attention and space present. This involved talking through it, doing some breath work and embodied work, and where necessary, refer to a therapist who worked with the group. With time, these processes increased with the level of trust among the group. For instance, we saw that interpersonal expressions that were frequent at the beginning of the group formation lessened as the group got more understanding of each other. A connection brought on through laying bare of lives, fostering a form of mutual empathy, understanding of each other, love, looking out for each other, and it's a form of kinship. And then there's another school I won't go in given its time, but I've just given one example there around holding space. And the third I locate in nourishment as food, which is really important. And Andrea just brought me some contention, which I really needed, because the body has to keep going and food nourishes it in that regard. So physical hunger and lack of food is a common occurrence in a context like South Africa, especially for the unloved. And as researchers, we're aware of this and therefore built this into our writing under the small stipend and raw meetings after the group, but also food. And both central requirements. For some, the food we provided would be the only meal for the day. And so the food was in abundance, some to take home for dinner. During the beginning phase of the project, there were clashes over which food order should be brought in. But as the group cohesion developed, the project manager of the theatre group would order orders each week of what was prepared and served. And as we got to know each other in true kin, we knew what each of us preferred in terms of depending on what food was ordered. For instance, up to now, when Nomsa is eating some steamed bread. Steamed bread is a kind of delicacy. He said, "Oh, I'm thinking of you because I know you like steamed bread." And so this speaks to element of kin. So we knew each other and knew what each of us preferred in terms of food, depending on what was ordered. We mostly ordered food from Sis Ivy. Sis Ivy was a small business caterer who prepared traditional food, South African food. This is the same food we ate at the colonial South School, if you remember. And we ate together. So we made sure we ate together. We had a resident theatre space which we worked at for the entire 3 years. We sat out on the lawn of the theatre space and ate together. And snacks were provided during the break. This is where we ended up eating as well. And those who smoked did. I have very fond memories of us laughing, fighting, gossiping, teasing each other, complaining, crying, comforting each other, giving each other advice during meal times, to mention but a few. Myself being non-South African, the group made an effort to teach me, for instance, some basic Afrikaans, Afrikaans slang, mostly bad words. Usually those of us who smoked during the sun, sharing the cigarette, I got teased a lot that I was shy and quiet in the beginning when I first joined the group, and how I became loud and part of the group. So this closeness and bond built as part of kin remains very strong for me. Actually, for instance, I get called often for updates or problem solving or whatever's still going on up to today. The recent one being last week. So this is my kin. So the theatre processes have a strict code of conduct. So the food was always eaten at the same time, which was during call time or breaks. So call time was an hour prior to rehearsals or training and workshops. And members were given time to arrive ahead of time in order to narrate and have a moment to recollect. And if there were any group issues that were raised at times, addressed or resolved during call time. And initially, the facilitator, stage manager, would round up the group, but as time went on, this became encountered, so members would round themselves at the end of call time. So call time became a tradition, and so the nourishment of the body and communion together. So, I have a show here around theoretical framing in relation to food and kinship, but I think you get the idea. And of course, there are various elements in entanglement with food in relation to communing, and this other elements in relation to spirituality. So, in conclusion, in November, December 2021, we launched the Independent Sex Workers Theatre Company, the first on the continent. The Independent Sex Workers Theatre Company is now housed under the NGO, but not without contestations or problems, which I still hear about. And they continue to do the work around creative activism and decriminalization and destigmatization of sex work. As I have discussed here, the process was full of ups and downs, joys and heartaches, mistrust, shifts between building of trust and, but pendulum shifted quite often at times, that it wasn't constantly trust and mistrust. About it's when you're unloved, doesn't it? Brilliant. So what happens to us in the encounter? The unloved researchers, NGOs, and funding one room for a period of about 4 years. It calls for thinking through research process of the intersection with decoloniality from the deployment in order to disrupt, push, shift, grammars of difference and separate positions from the borders, those questions, sexuality, and that push them out at the periphery. And during that, we trying to de-link from coloniality and to collaboration as praxis, but of course with cultural structural borders and bridges intimacy and kinship, which meant this need commitment towards radical and transformative shift, which is around shifting, pushing, offering something more dignity. And again, this was all we were left to see with this.
Great. Thanks so much, Phoebe, for this very rich and moving lecture. We have a little bit of time for questions. So please, anyway, we'll do a round perhaps. Yeah, sure. I'll take a couple. Yeah. Yes. And please, anyone, there's no ice to break. Yeah. Open it all. Feel free. I can be microphone. Yeah.
To ask you, what were the main challenges you faced when going to make the groundwork, going to build a connection with those sex workers? What were the main challenges and the techniques, and how you overcame it and build a bond with them?
Pode perguntar em português também. Pode perguntar em português também.
Se quiser fazer em português, então eles podem fazer a tradução. Essa vergonha foi essa. Pessoal.
Phoebe, I remember that in the beginning, you are mobilizing Augusto Boal. Yes, how this how this stay with the
Okay.
Todo mundo
Tô contando fila, não? Can you hear me? Yes. I'm here digesting the nourishments that you gave us through systematizing vocabularies of research practice, especially because we're coming from some processes this week of recognizing how much the pressures of the neoliberal framework, not only with NGOs, but also within the academy, thickens our students and collaborators. And what I hear when you start to give names to these processes is the possibility of dealing with these sickening processes and thinking about cure. Because you're recognizing cultural labor, this concept. Cultural labor gives a place for us to recognize the work that needs to be done that is excluded from the productivist logic of individualized capital, individualized private property, individualized subjectivity that is so central to these institutions. And then I keep thinking about Fatima's talk yesterday about how much the state aligns with mainstream authorities within certain communities. And that's what happens when we talk about the negotiations between North and South and the many Norths and Souths and the plunders, that we deal with, is that they align with the authorities in the NGOs. And we know that the NGO plays a similar kind of mediating role as the state. In the academy, sometimes we forget, we think NGO is anonymous with community. Yes. Degree of hierarchy. No. So I think that it's more of a comment, first of all, to recognize the power of this vocabulary that you're creating, the need to circulate and systematize and inventory this vocabulary, and wanted to float with you this possibility of how this vocabulary could serve as well in our formative processes with students, especially, because I know that your research crosses classroom and outside classroom, so that when you talk about, how to think intersectionally and think decolonially, that it also crucial to that is sort of developing new vocabulary. So I'm sure that thank you, and then open up that possibility of articulating these research, teaching, and community spaces.
Thank you for that. I'll start with that. And in my head, I have an imagination of what an NGO should. So working so closely and seeing the violences. I mean, I see some of the good work, so to speak, but I also see the violences embedded in especially the neoliberal model that NGOs fulfill in the name of helping, where they reaffirm the same power dynamics supposedly you're working against in terms of community work. And indeed, in some of the initial writing I wrote about in this particular paper, I was unpacking the NGO university dynamic that we spoke about a lot, because they brought us all in the same room and you're like, we don't speak the same language, and each space has its own boundaries, but also power structures. And there are sort of violences that cross from one to another. And university and geodynamic is similar to what funding geodynamic is, but even within that, NGO space itself has asymmetrical power, so to speak. So I do have my own idea of what an NGO should look like. But of course, that's a radical idea. And when I teach it to my students, they all look at me like, you talk, it only happened in utopia. But we can imagine, we can start dreaming, right? Dreaming. It's part of opening up these possibilities in a sense, in addition, pushing where we can along border work. So the concept of cultural labor came to me way back during my doctoral work, where but actually before that, it was a thinking that I encountered being marked as a Black person in the Netherlands, and sort of the spaces I had to traverse that were extremely white and violent, and the kind of work I had to do to get to be seen, to get some form of visibility. So I couldn't name that particular process until, when I was reading for my PhD, and I was reading a lot, and I came across this term, and I was like, actually, that really pinpoints this process for me really well, and so I started developing it then, and I have a couple of articles out that really unpack this notion of partial labor. And indeed, it can be mobilized in a classroom and many other spaces. Yeah. Moving on to your question, Marta. Augusto Boal. Sarah would possibly be the right person to respond this to you really well, but indeed, perhaps I didn't get into it in detail here, the kind of theatre processes that the theatre group was trained in, or techniques that the theatre group was trained in. So they were trained in mostly 4 theatre techniques. And the first one, the very first one, which we talked about here, was Augusto Boal's Forum of the Theatre of the Oppressed. And this lasted over a period of 3 months, and it was facilitated by Delia Mayer, who's an Augusto Boal theatre maker, and the kind of narratives that came out of that 3-month theatre process was around lived experiences in relation to rights, the language around rights. So the performance that was performed on the back of this was around sex workers' rights, which is what the NGO does really as well. It's not only advocate for sex workers outside, as into, lobby for rights with policymakers. They also offer sex workers training on their rights. For instance, because sex work is criminalized. So, for instance, if you're arrested, you can't be held for more than 24 hours. It's your right to say, I've been held for more than 24 hours. You can't hold me longer than that. You have to release me. So if you don't know that, you'll stay in a cell for weeks on end. But if you know that, you can challenge the police officers around that. So it also has a legal team that they call on to come and assist and intervene around that. So this particular training on Boal's theatre of the oppressed really brought out the narrative of rights in a glaring manner. And this is theatre lingo. They call it image theatre, where you contort your body in a form of image. And you can create a very short skit out of that. Still really formulates part of this theatre group's work if they're to go out and perform to a group, of policymakers, healthcare practitioners, or whatever around. And the exterior, their storing of themselves. So they still draw a lot from Boal's image theatre in this regard. So, but Sarah can tell me more because she's a theatre maker. I'm not. In terms of challenges, oh my goodness, I don't know where to begin. But I touched on them in my framing of the unloved, really, that we were dealing with abject, multiple exclusions, So I don't know if any of us here can say that, we've sort of been in a position to work with somebody who's been living on the street for 15 years, and what that means. A million different things you can't possibly think about in terms of engaging. So it was mostly around that alienation as the main challenge that faces various challenges. But I think for us being researchers who thought into colonially was to constantly be critically reflexive, so we don't reassert the same asymmetrical powers we're trying to work against, because they have ways of creeping in, in various aspects, and some through university rigid rules, which, at times couldn't shift, but had to find a way to, meander around. But at times, just being positionally blind, like I said, I haven't lived on the street for 15 years. I can't possibly imagine what that kind of lived experience is. And so positionally blind in many ways around that lived experience. So so it was constantly being in check, constantly reevaluating positions around. This was over a period of 3 years, which is a long time. It's not 2 days or a month. It's 3 or 4 years.
We have time for one other round.
First, thank you. It was a pleasure to host you. And it takes a little time to process and digest everything here, so that's why I didn't ask before. But I have 2 questions. First, it's you said you presented for us how the theater and performance through body can translate experience and create bonding. And I want to ask if you see other forms of performance like sports that can build this kind of kinship and trust. And the other question is trust very tricky, not tricky, but hard thing to build in groups that don't see themselves as groups, the marginalized people, because people have been structured to not see themselves as groups, so that then they can't mobilize themselves and fight power structures. So how can we build trust and kinship in these kinds of framework? Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm particularly interested in race-class relations, and I was looking for your concept of load, and it became to be really pressing because regarding intersex workers, it seems a very specific entanglement, the possibilities of a very specific entanglement of race and class, mainly because we are dealing with racial society like South Africa, and we can use it to understand Brazil too. And here in Brazil, we have the comprehension of Sueli Carneiro in dispositive of racialness, that she used the racial component to understand that the race is shaping on how classes is lived. And we have the discussions of primitive accumulation, the idea of proletarians as the one who has nothing to sell but your skin. And sex workers are even dealing with the selling of their skins. And I would like to know from you how the concept of unload for you unveil the borders that race and class are creating together when they are indivisible, where they are impossible to be looked separate. That's it.
authorities here in 1597. And because of that, I'm working on the concept of enemy. But this concept, it's a good concept to see the relationship that the state imposed to us, to Black communities. But is a concept that I involved in a lot of, in a kind of militarism and masculinism framing. And when you bring the concept of unlove, first time I could see the possibility to mobilize this concept of unlove to think inside the Black communities, because in I think the notion of love or the notion of family presuppose belong in some way of the same community. And for us, we don't belong at all in the Brazilian society. So inside the Black communities, I could see in the first moment a good way to mobilize and change the masculinity, enfim, and militarism framework to work inside the community. But I'm when you develop the other criterions of the radical kinship and the radical intimacy, I think it's a good way to pose our narrative, our political dispute against the state, because we're not exactly using the same framework as the state. And when you use the notion of unlove to dispute a radical kinship or a radical intimacy or Ubuntu kinship, I think it's closer that exactly we political dispute historically here and change the framework. We are not mobilizing the same framework that the states mobilized to eliminate us. So,
concept of the enemy. I want to read it more around that. So would spaces like sport offer such space of kinship? Perhaps, I don't know. I guess those who are studying those kinds of communities or collectives might give you a better response in that regard. But perhaps it could be, I mean, sports is very much about teamwork. So I see form of team developing there, but I'm not in the right position to respond to that. And the second question around building trust with those who are constantly dehumanized and marginalized. I think I clearly laid out the sort of processes we went through in relation to working towards building that trust. As I mentioned, that trust oscillates. It's not constant. It's not like, you know, we've found trust and it will stay at ease. It's like a having relationship anyway, I suppose. I don't know. I'm just being out there. Where, you know, it oscillates constantly. So there are moments where it's strong and there are moments where there's really forms of mistrust, even after doing the work to build it, you know, through, the setting up of the SCARECOM, as I say, addressing the issue of the money and various other dimensions. Yeah, so there are moments of utter trust, and you think, okay, we're there, and then it's completely flipped over the head, because that's what happens when you are unloved and on the margins, and you wake up and your life has been completely turned upside down due to a number of reasons. The unloved as deployed through race and class. I'm not sure I quite got your question. I thought it was more of a comment. But I will iterate a point I made in relation to the intersections of race and class. If you recall the graph that I showed, that shows the historical wealth in South Africa, where about 5%, actually the Oxfam report that came out a couple of years ago points out how 1%, the top 1%, who are the majority white expatriates, they are the current president, Ramaphosa, who have managed to enter that elite group. Own 90% or control 90% of the country's wealth. Now that in terms of numbers is mind-boggling, really. So it means the 90% are left to scrabble for 10%. So what does that mean for people of color in South Africa? And we see this through materially in high levels of unemployment, especially amongst youth. I think post-COVID it's clocking at 66%. That is mind-boggling, really, you know. So yeah, what does it mean in terms of livelihoods that regard it? And you have 4 mouths to feed, yeah, and sex work is an avenue. And within that dimension, if we're to look at intersectionalities of race and class and coloniality, Cape Town, for instance, is such a tourist haven for most of you who have been, if you have been, and you will know that. And it's also known as the gay city of the continent. But then if we're to evoke aspects in relation, for instance, nationalism, we see the left at the center, right at the one to white, cisgender, and the G has been co-opted into this calculus, and how alienation along other lines of racialized sexuality is happening, and how the tourist industry then, the queer tourist industry thrives not only through Cape Town being the gay city of the continent, but through this colonial imaginative of going to exploit sex work through that heavily racialized dimension and playing out in that regard. I hope I'm making my point and getting it and feeling relevant. So that plays out in that calculus as well, of race and class through this colonial imagination that stereotypes and then plays out through sex work or transaction sex in that regard. Yeah, Tula, I really think about the concept of the enemy and how you mobilize it. I most certainly see relatability parallels with what's about as young love. And I'm wondering how, because you're looking at the Constitution specifically, right? How indeed the counter on a micro-political level, if really, radical kinship could be a counter to that or not. That's food for thought, really. I hope it made sense in what I said. I've been up since 5 o'clock.
Well, that's previous. Thanks so much. It was extremely rich, and we're very glad we have you for a bit longer. Everyone is welcome to interact with her, and you can find her to us, to Jula in particular. And thank you. We initially just thank you very much.
Because they are, it's the sound's not good for them today.
Yeah, this
So it's
hybrid modality.
they try to
This out.